wild animals because that's just the kind of guy he is. He and Abby have the perfect father-daughter relationship, and when he and Abby talk about the difficult subject of how operating on Ellie will kill her, Abby tells her father that if it was her, she'd want her father to do the operation, because of course she would. Then we see the Washington Liberation Front base, where we get to see how they're all really nice people, and then we play fetch and pat the nice doggies that we've been killing as Ellie, which happens again later with the same dog Ellie kills at the end of day 3. Abby's section focuses on the conflict with another faction, called the Scars, who are at war with the Washington Liberation Front, and the Scars are shown to be infinitely worse people. Therefore, while Ellie has been killing good, normal people all this time, Abby instead kills this evil cult. During this, Abby saves 2 children from the cult, and the youngest, a boy named Lev, then forms a bond with Abby that is similar to that between Joel and Ellie in the first game. And do you like Abby yet? Don't you feel bad for what Joel did when he saved Ellie? Don't you feel bad for thinking that Joel was a good person? Aren't you feeling like a monster for what you did as Ellie? Do you remember those nice little innocent dogs? Well, you stabbed them. Yeah, you pat that dog, you piece of shit. And now look how happy that pregnant woman is. Well, was, before you killed her. Ooh, you must feel so guilty, you bad, bad player. Really, it just feels very manipulative. And while some stories might get away with manipulating their audience, The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't, because it's all so obvious, so in your face, and so incessant. It's as if the writers decided a set of specific emotional responses they wanted to force players to feel, but being force-fed these emotions isn't effective storytelling. It's a bit like when a parent is trying to force a child to eat their vegetables, and it just makes the child hate the vegetables even more. Like the writers are saying, here, you will play as Abby for 12 hours, and you're gonna like it, because we want to make some grand point about revenge and forgiveness, so do what we say because that's what's good for you, and don't you dare try thinking for yourself, you stupid, stupid child. And that's wrong. The relationship between a strict parent and a child is not what the relationship between the writer and the player should be. You shouldn't need to spoon-feed your audience in order to elicit a desired emotional response. Instead, you should tell your story and let your audience interpret it the way they want. Let them have the emotional response that's natural for them, not the one you chose for them. This is what great art should be about. It's what it should strive for, and while an artist might have specific intentions, they should still be hidden, things that sit waiting to be unearthed underneath layers and layers of subtext and personal interpretation. And The Last of Us Part 2 fails spectacularly at this. A better story would have allowed players to feel the way they feel, and that doesn't mean the story had to end with Abby dying, but it does mean the story has to avoid relying on players liking Abby. You can't deliberately create an emotional response in people and then dictate all these bullshit terms and conditions and wonder why people suddenly aren't on board with your story. A good story wouldn't need to do that, and the ending of the first Last of Us shows that, because Joel did something very bad and people responded to that in all sorts of different ways, but all of those ways were allowed to be valid. People were allowed to feel what came natural to them, they were allowed different interpretations, and so, despite the fact that a beloved character kills numerous innocent people and potentially dooms humanity, nobody threw a temper tantrum because a character they like might not be doing what they want. Instead, they praised the story and the characters and the writers. I think this is the main thing people disliked about The Last of Us Part 2, and it's certainly the main thing I dislike about it. But there are a few other things that I want to at least touch on in the second half of the game as well. When I started playing as Abby, I was looking forward to the ways in which her story would recontextualize Ellie's. After all, they cover the same period of time, and the idea of seeing a set of events from one character's eyes, and then from a different character on the other side of a conflict, is really interesting as an idea. However, Abby's story recontextualizes nothing. The only thing it might make you consider is that the WLF aren't so bad, they're just normal guys, and that Ellie's actions were wrong. But we don't need Abby's story for this. We see enough evidence of this in Ellie's story, so all this effort to humanize the Washington Liberation Front just comes across as unnecessary because they already seemed human. However, when it comes to humanizing those you kill, the new group, the Scars, are the exact opposite. Their ideology just doesn't seem reasonable. They follow this absurd extremist set of beliefs where they avoid all technology, except guns, because I guess Americans don't view guns as technology, and then they do stuff like clip the wings of children who misbehave, which means they shatter their arms by repeatedly hitting them with a hammer. Like, what the fuck? Who would do that to a child? It's so cartoonishly evil. In the first game we saw people do terrible things, but outside of David, their reason for doing those things was because of survival. It was the struggle for survival that brought out the worst in humanity. With the Scars, that's not the case. They just have a really evil set of beliefs because it's their religion. The design of the Scars also seems to be an attempt to dehumanize them. They all have the same appearance, with the same uniform and shaved heads for males, or a single hairstyle for females. In combat, they don't communicate to each other by using real names, like the WLF do. Instead, they use this dumb whistling. And even the name, Scars, just sounds stupid. I had thought The Last of Us Part 2 was trying to avoid the classic gaming trope of generic nameless enemies who are seen as okay to kill because they're the bad guys. But the existence of the Scars completely contradicts and erases this idea, and on top of that, they're not even interesting. The Scars are left feeling underdeveloped, and the information we do have paints them as some cliche, over-the-top, evil Christian death cult, which just seems a bit dumb in an otherwise grounded setting. And because the story is focusing on the Scars and two new characters called Lev and Yara, it ends up having nothing to do with Ellie's story. It's a set of parallel events which are almost completely unrelated, and that just seems boring. It's a bit like a filler arc in an anime you just skim over to get back to the actual story, and it seems like there was a real missed opportunity to tell two interconnected stories where we could have seen the same events from two different perspectives. As for the characters themselves, both those in Ellie's story and Abby's, they're just not very interesting. Naughty Dog once seemed to have a real knack for creating believable dialogue and likeable character interactions, but that seems to have been forgotten entirely in this game. Instead, the characters are dry, and none of them seem to have any real chemistry. The pair the game tries hardest to force is Ellie and Dina, who aren't terrible, but their whole lovey-dovey couple act gets old really quick, which I think is mostly because that stuff is always annoying. Most romances, in all types of media, focus on two characters meeting and falling in love. They don't focus on that period just after they fall in love, and I think there's a reason for that, which is because it's awkward. It's like when you know a real-life couple that won't shut up about how happy they are and how perfect they are for each other. It doesn't matter if it's in real life or fiction, it's annoying and a little bit cringy, and that's Dina and Ellie. Other character duos are worse though, because at least there's something between Dina and Ellie, whereas everyone else is just forgettable. The best dialogue and characterization are in the flashbacks between Joel and Ellie, which serve as a reminder of what's been lost in more ways than one. Anyway, the weaker cast of characters surely hasn't helped fan reception, as it just draws attention to how much better the first game was in this regard, thanks in large part to Joel, the characters the writers kill a few hours into the experience. So by the time you do get to the ending and Abby's and Ellie's stories reconnect, a lot of people are dead, a lot of bad things have happened, and it can be a little hard to care anymore. You're not responsible for the bad things that have happened, despite what the game wants you to feel, and most characters, in particular the two protagonists, Ellie and Abby, are not likeable because of all the bad things they've done. If you've let go of your revenge by this point, as the writers want you to do, there isn't really anything left to hold on to instead. And if you do still crave revenge, well, you won't get it. Although rather than that being something that happens in the confrontation at the end of day 3, instead there is a 4-hour epilogue that unnecessarily draws the ending out far longer than makes any sense. Just for comparison's sake, the first game's ending, which was probably the most praised part of it, lasted about 8 minutes, from the moment Joel rescues Ellie to the credits rolling. 8 minutes versus 4 hours. But length isn't the only difference. Anyway, Abby fights Ellie, but then lets her go because Lev asks her to. Then we skip forward in time to see Ellie and Dina now living alone with their newborn child, and you might wonder why this lesbian couple have a newborn child, but I can't even bring myself to explain it, so just accept that's a thing, it doesn't matter. Just move on. Anyway, Ellie and Dina live happily ever after, except Ellie is still haunted by Joel's death. Tommy finds some new information on Abby, but Ellie isn't interested in going for revenge, except then she changes her mind. So again, she hunts down Abby, who has since been captured by a new faction of slavers. Ellie then frees Abby, saving her life, but then she decides she actually wants to kill Abby, but only if Abby is willing to fight back. So Ellie threatens to kill Lev to force Abby to fight her. They try to kill each other again, except as Ellie's strangling Abby to death, she remembers an old conversation with Joel, and then she changes her mind again and lets Abby go. Although I'm not sure how Abby would survive with all those stab wounds anyway. But presumably she does, and Ellie goes home to find that Dina has left. The game ends with her in this empty house, where she picks up her guitar that Joel had previously taught her how to play, except she can't play it anymore, because during their fight, Abby bit off 2 of her fingers. And this scene feels like a perfect way for this game to end, because it's so over the top and representative of the rest of the game's storytelling. Ellie has lost a part of herself in her quest for revenge, which the writers decide to depict literally by showing how she's lost her fingers. And this also shows how she's lost some of her connection to Joel by the way these events have changed her. When I first saw Ellie's missing fingers in this scene, I couldn't help but laugh out loud, and I'm not sure that's what the writers were going for. In fact, I'm sure this was meant to come across as a piece of profound commentary, but really by this point it was all starting to seem comical. The violence and misery these characters experience is so constant and extreme that it's hard not to be numb to it. I've always thought that violence is something you have to be careful not to overuse. If you look at some of the best examples of movie violence, things like Psycho or Jaws or Alien or Reservoir Dogs, the most effective moments of violence either come out of nowhere and catch the viewer by surprise, or they're preceded by a gradual build-up of tension. By comparison, The Last of Us Part 2 has scenes of ultra-violence from beginning to end, and it's hard to keep taking it seriously. It's like jump scares in a horror game. There's only so many times they can be used before they lose effectiveness. The same is true for all the bad stuff that happens to people. Even after all the Seattle events, terrible things just keep happening. Ellie has PTSD, Abby and Lev get captured by slavers and crucified after they try to escape. Abby gets stabbed repeatedly, Ellie gets her fingers snacked on, and then it ends with Ellie alone, a shell of her former self with no family and friends or anything positive in her life whatsoever. There's other stuff I haven't mentioned too. Of the 2 kids, Lev has to murder his mother because he's trans and she doesn't accept his gender identity, and Yara has her arm repeatedly broken by a hammer, which then gets infected, so it has to be amputated, and then she gets killed anyway. Honestly, it's too much. And not too much as in it's so dark that it's hard to stomach, which it certainly could be for some people, but even if you do have a high tolerance to this stuff, it's just too much to keep taking it seriously by the time the credits roll. In the first game, Ellie is almost raped, which is a shocking and deeply disturbing moment. If instead Ellie was actually raped and then tortured and then forced into slavery, that wouldn't have made The Last of Us a better game, it just would have been fucked up. And if stuff like that happened over and over, it would be like The Last of Us Part 2. This game does provide commentary on vengeance and violence, in that it has a strong message that these are bad, and yeah, I knew that. Everyone knows that. I don't think that's something anyone needed this game to tell them. It's not exactly a brave or original message, and even when people enjoy a story about revenge, I think they're still aware that revenge isn't necessarily a good thing. A lot of players did want revenge against Abby, but I don't think the game successfully proves the futility of that to these players because they never get to experience that revenge, so they never get to see it as pointless. As for violence, sure, in cutscenes you're made to question violence and the role it plays in video games, but then you go back to the gameplay and killing is as fun as it's ever been. The other theme behind this story is that of the circular nature of violence and vengeance, how violence begets violence, and one act leads to another in an endless loop of destruction. This is what Abby tries to break when she lets Ellie go at the end of the Seattle section, and what Ellie finally learns while strangling Abby after that. There's also an element of learning how to deal with grief and finding acceptance and forgiveness for those who have wronged you. And, you know, that message may have been more effective if it didn't come at the end of these characters doing so many awful things. So what if you can find forgiveness, overcome your grief and break the cycle of vengeance, if, to do that, you have to kill hundreds of innocent people first and suffer through so many awful things? I strongly believe this story is messy and conflicted and not even close to being the deep artistic masterpiece so many critics depicted it as. Which doesn't mean it's terrible. It's still stylish and well presented and generally engaging, but the second half is weak and the ending just feels empty. So what does that mean for the game as a whole, and the response of critics and fans? When I started writing this video, I thought I'd try to keep it light-hearted, something about 30 minutes long with a few thoughts on the game itself, and a look at the biggest talking points from critics and fans. I guess I've failed somewhere along the way, because this is looking a lot longer than 30 minutes, and it doesn't feel very light-hearted to me anymore. Previously, I never felt that I disliked The Last of Us Part 2. I honestly do think it's a good game. The gameplay is enjoyable, the presentation is superb, and I had fun with the 25 hours I spent with it. I do agree that the fan reaction was over the top, but now that I've actually spent some time putting my thoughts onto paper, I'm starting to find it a lot harder to say I like this game, and I think I know the reason why. You see, for once, I really was ready to side with game journalists on this one because, call me old-fashioned, but back in my day we used to play games before deciding that they were trash, and so the low user score on the morning of the game's release just didn't sit right with me. But while I don't agree with either the user score or the critic score, now that I've completed the game and had some time to reflect on it, one of these scores seems a lot worse than the other. Not all opinions are equal, but I do feel that within reason, we should all get a chance to express ourselves. If people don't like something, they should have a chance to voice that opinion, whether that is by a professional review on an established website, or by a user review on Metacritic, or by a long, rambling YouTube video that no one in their right mind would watch. However, there seems to be a lot of hatred towards user scores, particularly coming from critics themselves. I've seen a lot of people talk about how much fans are overreacting, how stupid the user score is, and how this is why you just can't trust user scores. But no one has a problem with negative user reviews for a game they don't like Star Wars Battlefront 2 or Fallout 76. And yet, as soon as people make negative user reviews for a game critics like, suddenly it's no longer normal people leaving negative user reviews, it's review bombing and bots. And I dislike that attitude because, within reason, people should be able to express themselves, even when you don't agree with them. And saying they dislike some game because they didn't enjoy it is within reason. User reviews are important. They can tell you things about a game which matter, that critic reviews don't always communicate effectively. For example, if a game has microtransactions, this is very likely to lower the user score much more than the critic score, and this can act as a warning for people who might want to avoid games with this feature. The most recent section of Steam user reviews can be a good warning against games that have been abandoned by their developers, or a positive indication for games which have been patched and improved since release. User reviews are valuable for consumers, and no one is forcing you to agree with them. If they aren't useful for you, you can just ignore them. They're only user reviews. They have barely any effect on sales, they don't lead to awards, and they don't make it onto game boxes or promotional artwork. Overall, the consequences of negative user reviews just don't matter that much. There's also been a lot of talk about how the user reviews for this game are just extreme because of politics. In this example, the idea is that The Last of Us 2 has many progressive elements, like multiple LGBT characters, and this will cause right-wing people to dislike the game and give it a lower score. And I completely accept and agree that this is something that happens, probably a lot, probably far too much. Political expression is everywhere on the internet. People are always angry over something, and this can cause reviews to be biased. But this isn't one-sided. If people are critical over something for some right-wing reason, then it's just as likely that people are praising something for some left-wing reason, and vice versa. It's stupid to say that on the internet only one side cares about politics in media. It's definitely not just one side. And when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2, there are so many other reasons people may dislike this game that have nothing to do with politics. You can't simply discard these valid opinions just because for some of the people who dislike the game, some of their reasons might be political. And user reviews can be emotional and hyperbolic and biased. They're probably not the most accurate representation of a game's quality, but critic scores aren't some perfect assessment of quality either. People seem to have this opinion that user scores are a problem because they may not be accurate, but when critic scores are inaccurate, that's apparently fine, as if we're holding user reviews to some higher standard than reviews made by professionals who do this for a career, which is insane. You want to know what I think is the biggest reason for the low user score? It's not politics, it's not leaks, it's not the death of any character. It's that the critic score for this game is wrong, and that caused a reaction. A reaction that was magnified by all those other factors, but it's the critic score that really set people off. People want their voice to be heard, they want their opinion to be represented, and for people who don't belong to the gaming media, or have their own YouTube channel or thousands of Twitter followers, and who don't feel their view is being represented, the easy way to remedy that is to leave a user review. And yeah, those people might be angry and irrational, and so they rate the game a 0 or a 1 rather than something more fair like a 5 or 6, but who cares, it's their review. And that leads me back to the reason that I ended up disliking this game, and it wasn't because of Abby or Neil Druckmann or anything like that, it was because the praise this game received from critics is, in my opinion, undeserved. And I care, maybe a little too much, about whether a game is good and whether it's recognised as good by others, and the idea that people are calling this game a masterpiece on the basis of its story just seems ridiculous. It reminds me of a quote I saw in one of Super Bunny Hop's videos that said, "The best way to fail as a critic is to suggest that something's perfect without fully explaining why." And these 10 out of 10 reviews barely justify their scores. They're so full of all these glowing statements that are left completely unsubstantiated because of the strict NDA and the desire to avoid spoilers. Meanwhile, real issues with the game are just sidestepped or avoided entirely, and that's not even the fault of the critics themselves, it's the result of the very infrastructure of this review system that critics can't talk much about the game's most important parts, and the unusually strict NDA Sony imposed on this particular game just cements that fact. And so, that's where user reviews come in. They tell the other side to this story, a little like the Abby section was meant to do in this game. They offer a different perspective, and it's important they exist even if you don't like them, because without them you only get half the discussion. These two scores function together, like yin and yang, and that often seems to be the case, because I do think, for the majority of games, the score they really deserve tends to be somewhere in between the critic and user score. So, user scores are important. Sometimes critics miss things. Sometimes critics are biased. Sometimes critics are just wrong. And the more wrong they are, the more those non-critics react. It's like a negative feedback loop that keeps things in balance, and of course it's not a perfect system, not even close, but having one without the other would be far worse. I want to end this video by doing something I have never done before, which is to give a game I've talked about in a video a numerical score out of 10. So, in my honest opinion, judging all facets of this game and trying to be open-minded and fair, The Last of Us Part 2 is a solid 7 out of 10, and guess what? If you add the critic score with the user score and divide by 2, that is exactly what you get.
and it was unlike anything the industry had seen at that point. The speed of its engine was maintained by its excellent gameplay, although it had limitations. Limitations that the developers wanted to build upon in order to create something truly timeless. For one, Wolfenstein 3D's levels are made up of rooms of equal height. Look at them as though they are dungeons in the original Legend of Zelda. Rooms that connect to each other and are spread across a single floor, with keys strewn about to create a puzzle box of sorts. Wolfenstein is no different. However, this made it difficult to communicate level elements to a player effectively with routes for progression. In Zelda, your route is ultimately clear, even if the means of proceeding isn't. In Wolfenstein, you're gonna find yourself checking every door to find your path. Oftentimes, the halls of Castle Wolfenstein will lead you to dead ends with treasure for score and extra lives lying around, both of which the industry was slowly evolving away from as home consoles and PCs became better homes for games than arcades, and as games shifted away from the arcade-conditioned high-score philosophy. What I think the designers strove for most was giving each level identity beyond unique art on the walls, an escape from those boxed-in series of corridors. Thankfully, John Carmack's upgrades to the engine allowed for this to become a reality. Once dubbed the Doom engine and later id Tech 1, graphical trickery enabled the engine to simulate different levels of elevation in a level, when in reality the game existed solely on a flat 2D plane. This is why the game will automatically land your bullets in enemies that appear to be above you. Walls and floors could also move to shift in accordance with scripted sequences, and there was an actual lighting solution this time. The team at id Software poured their blood, sweat, and tears into Doom. Adrian Carmack and the other artists were sculpting clay models of the enemies, taking photos of them at different angles, and creating 2D sprites based on those models. John Romero was crafting some of the most complex level designs that the engine could handle, to the point where his fellow programmers then had to figure out equally complex ways to accommodate for the levels. Midnight, December 10th, 1993. The first episode of Doom was uploaded to the internet as shareware, with the full game available for people to purchase directly from id Software if they so desired. And you all know the rest. The game is nearly 30 years old at this point, but I still think Doom holds up. Scratch that, it doesn't just hold up, it kicks ass. It is crucial to the history of video games, and nothing ever aims to dilute its focus. Kill demons, find secrets, solve puzzles, unlock doors. It never compromises on that vision. Let's talk about why Doom was such an important game in the wake of its release, and why it deserves to be experienced today. First of all, you select the first episode, pick your difficulty level, and bam, you're in the game. Doom makes itself known right away through Bobby Prince's metal midis, and the game begins its steady communication of ideas right here. The first level of Doom is painfully bare bones at first glance, but it establishes the cornerstones of a Doom level in a straightforward and subtle manner. The first area is empty with no enemies in sight, with 3 paths for you to take. If you head straight, you'll run into your first possessed soldiers, but if you head left, you'll be rewarded with a suit of armor that will cut down the amount of damage you receive from enemy attacks. And the third path is a secret. One of the first things a player's eyes will be drawn to upon loading in will be this open field just outside of the base. There's a suit of mega armor sitting in a pool of toxic waste, which will overcharge your armor all the way up to 200%, giving you significant protection from damage for a long time if you can make it last. A great way to kickstart your journey, and the secret path stocks you up on bullets and gives you a chance to sneak up behind the demons. Grabbing the armor, however, is dependent on finding a switch in the starting area that'll open a secret path outside. All of this stuff informs you of what is possible in Doom. Sure, you may have a clear path forward, but being well equipped for the journey ahead isn't always guaranteed. As such, you'll need to explore and think outside of the box. Check every nook and cranny and you'll be rewarded with new weapons ahead of their intended introductions and power-ups, which both give you an edge in combat. This will also intimately familiarize you with the level in front of you, the act of which will become a recurring theme. At the beginning of each level, you'll have no idea where to go or what to do, but by the end, it'll be like you've lived there. The game continues to prepare you for the road ahead. In the second level, you're introduced to keycards. One path is locked, and the other leads into a room with the keycard you need, surrounded by enemies. The path forward also establishes how a level's layout can organically drive the action in Doom. All it takes is a swarm of imps and a tight space to get the player to start making split-second decisions. Doom's combat channels that primal shoot-anything-that-moves instinct, but it is equally methodical. It's about picking the right tool for a job, whilst you strategically conserve ammo for the strongest enemies and the toughest encounters. It's a pretty engaging loop even today because it's either you or your enemy. If you get hit, that's on you. You need to be prepared for anything, and you'll need to either scour for health and armor pickups, or push back harder than them. Circle strafe around them, use your surroundings as leverage, know the best ways to deal damage, you get the idea. You're always moving, and you're always thinking. But levels are by far the most important factor in Doom's combat, and they are the reason Doom, on the whole, has stood the test of time. Locking you into a room as you acquire a new weapon, or shutting the lights off after grabbing a keycard, forces you to think on your feet. Navigating a claustrophobic maze, especially in the dark, means anticipating an ambush from around every corner. This conditioning process only becomes more relevant as you proceed, and the level designs become even crazier. Each episode starts you off with a default loadout, but they don't compensate for this in enemy placement at all, meaning that you immediately have to start shooting and hunting for better guns. At the beginning of episode 2, you're introduced to portals, which adds an entirely new layer of complexity to solving these labyrinths. Suddenly, it's as if two separate levels can exist at once, and they intersect with each other thanks to the keycards. And while you're figuring this all out, they're throwing pinkies and soldiers at you, lots of them. From here, they go hog wild. The second level of episode 2 has a cluttered and elaborate containment area linked to a central hub that feels like the UAC attached their building to a temple in hell. And this central hub also branches off into a series of segmented areas with 3 keycards and plenty of secrets. Because of the nature of the level, enemies aren't nearly as relentless, but they can mess you up from across long distances if you let your guard down. The third level, however, is the exact opposite. It's a claustrophobic, winding maze with plenty of enemies that force you to act quickly and effectively. And the Deimos lab continues to merge the UAC into hell, creating a mixed gauntlet of everything you've learned. The creativity never seems to die down as the game ramps up in challenge. If there was ever a time to put your pathfinding and resourcefulness to the test in finding secrets, it'd have to be in episode 3. When I said that Doom asked you to put work in before you could rip and tear, I meant it. Boss enemies become regular goons by this point in the game, and ammo doesn't grow on trees, so you'd best know why you're using each weapon and how much ammo you're gonna need to stave off the armies of hell. The levels themselves brutally sell this balance you need to strike. There are times where you'll need to choose the most efficient path, navigate a maze-like wasteland with dead ends that each hold pieces of the level's puzzle, complete sandboxes, clear gauntlets, and all while the demons continue to relentlessly pursue you. Some pursue you a little too closely. I really hate Lost Souls, especially when they're in large groups because they swarm you like little mosquitoes. But otherwise, I have a blast solving these levels, and they serve as proof of how puzzling level design can organically create tension, dictate pacing, and drive combat. In spite of its age, the level design of Doom is a masterclass in creating enthralling and creative FPS levels. They obviously don't fit the pace of every game, but the lessons are universal. In fact, Doom is one of the main reasons I am so passionate about level design, and not just because it was one of the first games I ever played. The levels communicate so much about the game and carry the fun through to the end. Thanks to these levels, Doom's primal and fierce combat loop is conveyed as something that needs to be treated like a game of chess, in which you need to use the right pawn for a job in an uncertain landscape. And in this case, your opponent is the level. One of the key components in creating a good first-person shooter from a modern perspective is making the shooting feel good. I mean, I probably didn't need to tell you that. But something that I feel they must also do is let the levels dictate how the shooting takes place. Simple or primitive shooting mechanics, especially in Doom's case, can only thrive in an environment that allows them to do so. Let me give you an example from a more recent game. You might think that Call of Duty Zombies was so successful because it just gave players an opportunity to turn their brains off and shoot, but the mode is way more intelligent than you'd think. Sure, you'll be shooting zombies by the thousands with no nuance or variation to its core combat, but without Juggernog, just 2 hits is enough to kill you. Even with Juggernog affording you 5 hits, 1 swarm is all it'll take to send you to an early grave. So you'll have to plan accordingly. Navigate effectively around the map to avoid getting cut off by zombies, think 2 steps ahead, communicate with your teammates, use your weapons strategically while preserving resources, and most importantly, watch your back. A lot of planning and thought goes into surviving for as long as possible. It's not just a shooting gallery. And you can trace the origins of this design philosophy straight back to Doom. Mindless on the surface, but attentive and strategic as you learn the rules of the road. Of course, it was their first attempt at fleshing out a game of this kind. There were bound to be missteps. Certain levels are a bit much, and they go overboard with their complicated layouts. The unholy cathedral in episode 3 is an endless maze with so many moving parts that a puzzle box with intelligently implemented combat spaces turns into, okay, everyone's dead, where do I go? And then you spend 10 minutes retracing your steps before you find the one path you missed. This is perhaps the greatest weakness of old school Doom's level design. The map you can access is rudimentary and only conveys so much information, so in the more complicated stages you may find yourself walking through the same hallways you've already visited to gather more information, and then you get lost and have to remember everything. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I have a strong distaste for the added 4th episode in the Ultimate Doom, Thy Flesh Consumed. The levels are cluttered with enemies and the terrain is unforgiving. Any inspiration that I can draw from its flexible level designs are undermined by the pits you have to cross while fighting barons, cacos, and these goddamn mosquito monsters. Just a barrage of shit on my screen all at once. Genuinely, there are some great ideas in these levels. This central hub full of enemies connects to tightly packed areas that have keys lying in wait, and it all loops back around once you can memorize where you've been. And then you have these massive hell cities with multiple buildings to search. However, Doom thrives when its level design directly inspires combat, whereas the level design in episode 4 actively works against it. I can barely keep track of what's under my feet or the walls that surround me, let alone the demons I'm trying to kill. If you ask me, and I know you didn't, but I'm gonna say it anyway, Sigil is what episode 4 should have been. In 2019, John Romero came back to Doom and designed his very own unofficial episode 5, which would later become official in the Bethesda-published source port on consoles. The imagination of Doom's sinuous design is heightened by Romero's decades of experience with the genre. Take a look at this level. You have 3 paths to take from the very beginning, and while you have to do them all eventually, it later becomes an endurance run of memorization and calculated movement. You also have a motley crowd of level shapes and layouts, tense lighting, terrifying corridors, intelligent enemy placement in comparison to episode 4, a perfect amount of challenge for testing even the most seasoned of Doom players, and for demonstrating, once more, how Doom's combat can shine brightest in the situations that a designer can create. Sigil's existence, in and of itself, is hard evidence of Doom's legacy. Because of the formula that had been established, Doom's engine and combat provided up-and-coming game designers with endless possibilities. So, then came the mods and the WODs. Once upon a time, I said that there were plenty of community mods and maps available for Half-Life 2 thanks to the Source engine. Doom mods make the number of mods for HL2 seem tiny in comparison. I won't discuss these mods in full detail because Doom mods exist in their own world separate from the context of the series' evolution, but they absolutely represent the legacy of this game. Brutal Doom in particular feels almost like an oddball reimagining of the original game, rather than just an ultra-violent upgrade. Weapons are reworked, and enemy AI and attack patterns have been rewritten to intensify the core combat loop. There are a lot of mods, and if you enjoy Doom in any capacity, id Software's episodes are only the beginning. That said, id Software did create a proper sequel to Doom in the form of Doom 2 Hell on Earth, although it feels more like a cross between a sequel and an expansion. I'll explain. Doom 2 focused primarily on expanding level sizes thanks to advancements in the engine, meaning more demons, more boss enemies amongst regular demons, and more possibilities for hiding keys. It only added one new weapon, the Super Shotgun, and a few new enemy types including the Mancubus, Revenant, Pain Elemental, and the godforsaken Archvile. The new demon types, as you'd expect, increased the variety in combat and level design. And make no mistake, the Super Shotgun may be the only new weapon, but it quickly becomes the most reliable one in the entire game. Tons of damage and plenty of ammo to draw from, despite it using 2 shells per shot. The new demons counteract its devastating power, therefore introducing a new way to balance your weapon strategy. Aside from that, the basic combat pattern goes largely unchanged. What does instill innovation in this pattern is the focused level design of Doom 2. Levels often have discernible theming, even more so than the original game. You have the UAC facilities that show you the ropes, followed by the expansion in both size and ideas as you connect the dots in a jungle of halls and towers. My favorite levels take place in the city, because you have a ton of buildings in an enclosed space that are separate by design and appearance, but connected through keycards, portals, and shortcuts. That and there are demons overlooking every corner of the city, so there's nowhere to run. So much thought and consideration went into these levels, and this continues into Hell. Barrels of Fun and the Monster Condo serve as the most poignant examples. More so the Monster Condo, as its areas are themed after rooms you'd find in a mansion and puzzles fall in line with that description. The other level that certainly makes a name for itself with its central idea is the Chasm. I don't think I need to say it, but this is probably the worst level in Doom 2 by a long shot. Remember Episode 4's tricky platforms and hellish enemy placement? Well, imagine that distilled into a single level and cranked up to 11. Just rewatching this footage is giving me anxiety. I can remember how frustrated I was with the thin paths and the lost souls, and I remember getting lost and having to trek all the way back through the same paths I'd already traversed. This should be a textbook demonstration of how easy it is to get lost in levels this big, and this becomes especially apparent as the game draws to a close. Their goal of making bigger levels was certainly achieved, but in levels like the Chasm, you begin to wonder if that goal was justified. Doom 2's best levels are densely packed and make great use of their size, whereas levels like this are bloated and confusing. The game, at the very least, has an astounding conclusion for the time period. The Icon of Sin is intense due to the terrain and the sheer amount of enemies throwing themselves at you, and it's hard to maintain patience. And while all of this is going on, the music is nothing but a faint, ominous whistle. Doom 2 is a great sequel, even if I use the word sequel loosely. It feels more like a definitive version of the original game, with greater theming, proper design cohesion, more enemies, and a more powerful version of the same engine. However, the January 1995 issue of Next Generation magazine summed the game's circumstances up better than I ever could. Now that the first-person interface has become the design of choice for the entire industry, it will need to find new innovations, or it will quickly find it's playing catch-up in its own game niche. So what did they do? They made Quake. But first, a brief intermission as we ask the age-old question: can it run Doom? In the 90s, Doom was something that was best experienced on a PC. But home consoles, where the vast majority of gamers played during that time period, deserved a chance to have Doom. This resulted in a slew of home console ports that all aimed to give players that chance, with varying degrees of success. So just for fun, let's take a brief look at the history of console Doom ports. The best console version of Doom to release in the 90s, if you ask me, is the PlayStation version. In one package, you get Doom and Doom 2 with enhanced graphical effects, and a terrifying soundtrack composed by Aubrey Hodges, who would later go on to create a bone-chilling score for Doom 64. More on that later. Doom on the PlayStation was an entirely unique and worthwhile experience, transforming each encounter and every hallway into an unpredictable bout with demons that can easily overwhelm you. The atmosphere completely shifts, and it makes those tense moments from the original DOS version that much more horrific. Speaking of horrific, the Sega Saturn version was based on this port, but it was horrible. It was originally going to use a hardware-accelerated engine that would deliver the definitive console port of Doom, but id Software denied the use of this engine due to the texture distortion that occurred, thus forcing the developers to use software rendering and causing the end result to have an unplayable frame rate. Still, due to it having the finesse of the PlayStation version, I guess it's technically better than the 3DO port. This one has an interesting history. Developed by Art Data Interactive, it was promised to be an ambitious conversion, with more content and graphics superior to the DOS version. But due to mismanagement, a sole programmer, Rebecca Heinemann, was contracted to complete a port of the game in 10 weeks. The soundtrack was re-recorded by the CEO of Art Data and his band in a garage, and the end result sounds pretty good. And the engine was modified and optimized to the best of Rebecca's abilities in the time that she was given. The end result was, simply put, impressive for being completed in a 10-week deadline, but definitely not the port that was being hyped up back then. If you'd like to learn more, Rebecca discussed the full story in a video. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Each console port has its quirks, and nearly all of them are missing content. The 32X version looks and runs well, but it has music that sounds like somebody emptying their bowels. This is not the fault of the Genesis sound chip. This is just poor utilization of it. Take a listen to the kick-ass metal soundtrack of Thunder Force 4. This is the kind of stuff that only the Genesis was capable of back then, and it's a shame that the Doom soundtrack couldn't be translated well. The Jaguar version was developed by id Software themselves, and by all accounts it's a great port, but rather than having butchered music, there isn't any music at all during gameplay. The Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance ports are both comparable, and they both have a low resolution and inconsistent frame rate. The low resolution is more tolerable on the GBA's smaller screen, and both of these ports, especially the Super Nintendo port, were astounding technical achievements when they were released. They definitely laid the groundwork for what was possible when Doom's source code was released to the public. As technology got better, console Doom ports would eventually become viable ways to experience the game, with the 7th and 8th generation ports by Nerve Software being excellent equivalent options for those without access to a home computer. Although, for a game like Doom, you don't necessarily need a video game console. In 1997, it released the source code for Doom, and thus began the era of Can It Run Doom, in which skilled programmers ported the game to anything with buttons and a screen. Printers, an ATM, a thermostat, a calculator, even a pregnancy tester can run Doom. Truly, we are blessed to exist in a timeline wherein you can find out you're pregnant and play Doom on the same device. With all that said, what is the best way to play Doom today? Well, there are a ton of source ports available on PC right now. If you'd like to play the game in its original, unaltered form with customizable controls, then your best option is Chocolate Doom. It aims to be as accurate as possible to the original DOS release, even maintaining bugs found in that version. For the sake of the video, this is how I recorded all of my footage for Doom and Doom 2, and it's usually how I prefer to replay the games today. Otherwise, most people swear by GZ Doom. It is fully customizable inside and out, supports high frame rates, and almost any mod that you can think of will work with it, including Sigil. In fact, the config file tells you to use GZ Doom. For years, it's been the go-to source port for plenty of people, however, the more recent and official Unity port has come to rival it. Regardless, you have plenty of great options. Quake was id Software's first truly 3D game, complete with jumping, 360 degrees of vision, and multi-leveled layered structures and levels that weren't possible in Doom. It carried an unsettling yet unmistakable atmosphere with it, beautifully and terrifyingly evocative of Lovecraftian horror. It was a great game, and it sent shockwaves throughout the industry. Up until this point, any game that attempted to imitate Doom or flesh out the core of its identity would be perceived as a Doom clone. Quake changed everything. The term first-person shooter would be adopted, the WASD mouse combo was popularized, and thus began a new era for the genre. And the genre would expand and transform as it incorporated elements from adventure games, RPGs, stealth games, and more, until the first-person perspective became just another means of delivering games. As the years went by, designers were constantly finding new ways to create shooters. Half-Life's unbroken narrative was carried through to the end with scripted sequences, breathing life into the Black Mesa research facility, and the Resonance Cascade that started it all. Everything unfolded before your very eyes without it ever taking control away from you. But on top of that, it involved the player in problem solving in order to proceed, forcing them to assess the world around them and think differently about how to approach situations. And then, the full-blown modernization of the first-person shooter genre as we know it came along. Halo Combat Evolved. This game demonstrated how a decidedly linear shooter could differentiate its levels with varied encounters, and colossal enemy bases that you'd have to storm either on foot with strategy, or with a high-powered vehicle. It also had a strong focus on its weapons. You could only carry 2 weapons at a time, but each of them had their own distinct purpose, and they can benefit you when used effectively. It's an adaptation of what made the combat of Doom work so well in the first place, and you have to play aggressively in order to obtain the more powerful weapons at a level. It's all about thinking critically, resourcefully, and carefully. Although the game was unquestionably straightforward from beginning to end, the game asks you to consider so much, and that careful consideration, the planning that goes into storming a base or taking down hordes of elites, is what kept Halo alluring throughout its run with Bungie, right up to the fall of Reach. As shooters continued to innovate and prosper in their own ways throughout the 2000s, shooters like Doom and Quake were slowly but surely left in the dust. Games were constantly iterating on the conventions that Doom established. Here are some examples. Perfect Dark had a freeform and interconnected objective system, itself an extension of Rare's other revolutionary shooter, GoldenEye. An objective system was a flexible and dynamic way to replace finding keycards in a level. You were meeting ever-changing criteria in order to advance, finding the figurative keys to proceed rather than literally. Half-Life 2 allowed its players to take control of a detailed physics engine to solve puzzles, kill enemies, well, do just about anything really. Halo 2 implemented a regenerating health system to keep its pacing in check, and in order to assist players in sharpening their decision-making. Things were moving pretty fast. When Doom was to make its triumphant return and show the new guys how it's done, it needed to either rethink the FPS genre, or stick to its guns and modernize its core gameplay. Doom 3 did neither of those things. While the game was commercially successful, I don't think it's a stretch to say that it became a footnote in both Doom's history and the genre's history. Today, it finds itself sandwiched between the legacies of both of its direct competitors that year, the two big H's. But it is an important game to the legacy of Doom. It made mistakes. Mistakes that future id Software designers would take it that year, the two big H's. But it is an important game